The door swung open and Rhett Coburn stopped dead in his boots. Smoke rising from the chimney he had not lit in 6 months. Light glowing from the window he kept dark on purpose. And a smell. Warm bread, thick stew, something sizzling in a cast iron pan that punched him straight in the chest like a fist wrapped in a memory he had spent 3 years trying to bury. His hand moved to the rifle on his back before his mind caught up with his instincts, because nobody cooked in this house. Nobody was supposed to. Not anymore. Not since the morning he came home 4 days too late and found the bedroom empty and the sheets cold, and the silence so complete it had its own weight, its own texture, like something you could reach out and touch if you were foolish enough to try. 3 years of that silence. 3 years of riding out before dawn and coming home to darkness. 3 years of eating cold beans from a tin because the act of lighting a stove and cooking a meal for one person in a kitchen built for two was a kind of cruelty he had decided he did not deserve and could not endure. So when Rhett Colburn stepped through his own front door on that October evening and saw a young woman standing at his stove with a wooden spoon in her hand and lamplight catching the gold in her hair, his first thought was not who is she or how did she get in or what does she want. His first thought was that the smell of bread baking was the most violent thing he had experienced in 3 years, more violent than the telegram that told him his wife was dead, more violent than the 4 days of hard riding that followed it, because those things had been sharp and sudden and finite. This smell was something else entirely. This smell was the ghost of every evening he had lost walking through his kitchen like it still lived there. The woman turned. She was young, early 20s at most. A face that belonged in a painting from back east, not standing in a rundown ranch kitchen 4 miles from the nearest town in Arizona territory. Heart-shaped with delicate features, eyes the color of cornflowers, large and direct, and holding something behind them that Rhett could not name right away. Not fear. Something older than fear. Something that had already been through fear and come out the other side carrying whatever was left. "My name is Emmeline Whitfield," she said. "And before you reach for that rifle, you should know that your dinner is almost ready." Rhett stared at her. His hand was still on the stock of the Winchester. His boots were still planted on the threshold. His mind was doing the thing it did when the world presented him with information that did not fit into any category he had prepared for, which was to say, it went very quiet and very still and waited for more data before committing to a response. "Lady," he said slowly, "you are standing in my house, I know. Cooking at my stove, yes." In my... He stopped, looked around. She had cleaned the place. The dishes that had been stacked in the dry sink for 2 weeks, the ones he kept meaning to wash and never did because meaning to do things required a kind of caring. He had misplaced somewhere around the 2nd year. Those dishes were washed and stacked proper on the shelf. The floor had been swept. The ash from the fireplace had been cleared. And the blanket on the chair, the one he left crumpled there every night because folding it would mean acknowledging that only one person used it. Now that blanket had been folded with precise, deliberate care by someone who understood that small acts of order were sometimes the only defense against chaos. "You cleaned my house," Rhett said. "It needed it," she said simply, and turned back to the stove. He stood there for a full 5 seconds with his mouth open and his rifle half raised, and absolutely no idea what to do next. He had expected a lot of things riding home that evening. A cold room, a quiet night, maybe a whiskey in the same chair he had been sitting in since the world ended 3 years ago. He had not expected a woman with cornflower eyes and flour on her sleeves making stew in a kitchen that smelled like everything he had lost. "How did you get in?" he finally said. "Your back window does not latch right. I noticed it from the outside." She glanced back at him over her shoulder. "You should fix that. Anybody could walk in." "Anybody did walk in," Rhett said flatly. Something almost like a smile crossed her face. Almost. She pulled the pot off the heat, set it on the iron trivet on the table, and laid out a bowl and a spoon like she was setting a proper table. Like this was a thing that happened here. Like there was not a man standing behind her with his blood running hot and his jaw locked tight and a Winchester repeater in his hands. "Sit down," she said. "Eat first. Then I will explain everything." "You will explain everything right now," Rhett said, "for I decide whether I am writing to the sheriff." And that was when the sound of horses came up the drive. 2 sets of hooves moving at the easy pace of men coming home from a day's work, and Rhett knew without looking that it was his brothers, Gideon and Nolan, coming back from checking the west fence line, which was the task he had assigned them that morning, because even on a ranch that was falling apart, someone had to pretend there were still things worth checking. The door opened behind him and Gideon came through first, because Gideon always came through first. 31 years old, 2 inches taller than Rhett, which put him somewhere near 6'6", with the kind of physical presence that made rooms feel smaller when he entered them. He had their father's jaw and their mother's eyes, amber-colored and sharp, and he carried himself with the coiled tension of a man who had been angry about something for so long that the anger had become structural load bearing the thing that held the rest of him upright. Gideon stopped when he saw the woman. His face went from tired to stone in the space of a heartbeat. Behind him, Nolan came through the door with the energy that Nolan brought to everything, which was to say he was already talking before he was fully inside. Something about a fence post and a coyote and a story that was probably only half true, and then he saw her too, and the words died in his mouth, which was notable because very few things in this world had ever succeeded in making Nolan Coburn stop talking. Rhett, Gideon said quietly. His hand had moved to his belt, where he kept a Colt revolver that he cleaned every Sunday, whether it needed it or not. Who is this? She says her name is Emmeline Whitfield, Rhett said. She was standing by the stove with her hands at her sides, looking at all three of them now. Three large men filling the doorway of a kitchen that suddenly felt very small. And she did not flinch. She did not step back. She stood her ground with the stillness of someone who had already calculated every version of how this moment might go and made peace with all of them. I saw an advertisement, she said, on the notice board at the Dry Creek post office. It looked like it had been there a while. Months, maybe. A mail-order bride advertisement. 3 brothers on a ranch looking for a woman to keep house and possibly become a wife. She paused. The advertisement listed this address. The silence that followed was the kind that has weight, the kind that presses down on a room and makes the walls feel closer. Rhett looked at Gideon, Gideon looked at Nolan, and Nolan looked at the floor. Nobody in this house posted any advertisement, Gideon said. His voice was ice on rock. More silence. Longer this time. And then Nolan, who was 27 years old and had spent most of those years developing an instinct for knowing exactly when a situation was about to become very bad and diving straight into it anyway, lifted his head and said the words that changed everything. I did. The kitchen went so quiet you could hear the stew bubbling on the trivet. You could hear the wind outside pressing against the window that did not latch right. You could hear 3 hearts beating at 3 different speeds for 3 very different reasons. Rhett turned to his youngest brother with an expression that Nolan had seen exactly twice before in his life, both times right before something got broken. What did you say? Nolan met his eyes. He did not look away, which took more courage than most people would understand, because looking directly at Rhett Coburn, when Rhett Coburn was angry, was like staring into a furnace and waiting to see if the door would hold. 6 months ago, Nolan said, the night of the anniversary. He did not have to say which anniversary. They all knew. The night you drank half a bottle of whiskey and sat at this table and wrote something on a piece of paper and then tore it up and threw it in the trash. Rhett went very still. I found it. Nolan continued. The pieces. I put them together and read what you wrote. And it was an advertisement for a mail-order bride. In your handwriting. In your words. And it was the most honest thing I had seen you write in 3 years, because you wrote it when you were too drunk to lie to yourself. You had no right, Rhett said. His voice was low and controlled and dangerous. You wrote it, Nolan said without flinching. I just made sure it got where it needed to go. I copied it clean and posted it on the board at the post office. No name, just 3 brothers on a ranch, the address, and what we needed. Because what you wrote when you were drunk was the truth, Rhett. This house is dying. We are dying with it. And you will not let yourself ask for help when you are sober, so I did it for you, Gideon cut in, then his voice ablaze. Both of you stop, he looked at Emily. You, how long on the road? I am not from Boston, she said. I am from Flagstaff by way of Tucson. I was on a wagon train heading for my cousin's place in New Mexico. 3 days ago, we hit a wash that flooded overnight. Lost 2 wagons, lost 1 man. My mule broke a leg in the flood and had to be put down. I walked 2 days to reach Dry Creek with nothing but what I could carry. She said those facts with the flat, efficient delivery of someone who had already processed the grief privately alone, the way she seemed to process most things. At the hotel, they wanted 15 cents a night. I do not have 15 cents. I do not have anything. I saw the advertisement on the board, and I walked 4 miles to this ranch. Nobody was home, so I started a fire and started cooking. I figured either you would come back and hear me out, or you would come back and throw me out. Either way, you would have a hot dinner waiting. Rhett looked at her for a long time. He looked at the bruise on her left wrist where the sleeve had slipped back, faded yellow, 4 or 5 days old. He looked at the boot with the split sole stitched back together with coarse twine. He looked at the hem of her ivory dress caked with dried mud from 2 days of walking through country that did not care whether you made it or not. She had not come here for romance. She had not come here because of some fantasy about life on the frontier. She had come here because she was out of road and out of options, and this kitchen, with its unwashed dishes and its cold fireplace, was the last stop before whatever comes after the last stop. Rhett lowered the rifle. He did not put it down, but he lowered it. 3 days, he said. You sleep in the barn. 3 days to prove you are useful. That is all. Gideon said one day. Nolan said you do not get to decide alone. Rhett said quiet, both of you. 3 days. And he sat down at the table and then picked up the spoon, put the spoon, and tasted the stew for the first time and did not say anything for a long moment because the stew was good. Better than good. Thick and seasoned with something he could not identify, the kind of warmth that started in your stomach and moved outward like the first fire of autumn. And he had not tasted anything that good in 3 years, and he was not prepared for how much that hurt. Fine, he said. 3 days. She was up before all of them the next morning. That was the first thing that surprised him. He heard sounds from the kitchen before daylight. The scrape of the fire poker, the clink of the coffee pot, and his body did something it had not done in 3 years. It relaxed. Not much, but some. The way a clenched fist loosens by a fraction when it hears a sound it remembers from before. By the time he pulled his boots on and walked to the kitchen, she had coffee ready and was standing at the window looking out at the yard with her arms crossed, reading something in the early light that he could not see. Morning, she said without turning. He poured himself a cup. The coffee was strong and hot and made by someone who understood that cowboys did not want their coffee to taste like flowers. Your east fence line, she said, still facing the window. The one running past the dry creek bed. About 60 yards of it is down. Rhett looked at her over the rim of his cup. Your chickens have not been laying because the coop has a gap in the back wall where something has been getting in at night. Probably a weasel. Your water trough by the barn has a crack running about 4 inches along the base. It has not broken through yet, but it will by winter if it freezes. Rhett set down his cup very slowly. How long have you been up? He said. About 2 hours. She pulled a chair out and sat. I made a list. She actually had a list, written on the back of a torn piece of brown paper in neat, precise handwriting that looked like it belonged in a schoolroom, not on a ranch in the Arizona territory. Fence repairs, coop repairs, the trough, missing shingles on the south side of the barn roof, a broken latch on the corral gate, the garden plot behind the house that had gone completely to weeds. You made a list of everything wrong with my ranch, Rhett said. I made a list of what needs doing, she said. There is a difference. Gideon had come in silently and was standing in the kitchen doorway reading the list over Rhett's shoulder. His face was doing something complicated, moving between skepticism and something that might have been reluctant respect. You walked the fence line before dawn, Gideon said. Could not sleep, she said, like it was the most obvious thing in the world. She looked at all three of them, then Rhett at the table, Gideon in the doorway, Nolan coming down the hall rubbing his eyes. Mr. Coburn, she said, addressing all of them and none of them specifically. I do not know what happened here. I do not know why this place is the way it is. It is not my business and I am not asking. But I have been working on ranches since I was 9 years old, and I can see what this land is supposed to be. It is good land. It has just been let go. 3 days is not enough to fix all of it, but it is enough to start. She worked like she had been born to it. That was the thing none of them could reconcile. The way she moved through the physical labor of the ranch with a quiet efficiency that reminded Rhett against his will of someone who knew exactly what each task demanded before she started it. She did not ask for help. She did not complain. She did not make a show of working hard so they would notice. She just worked, like the ranch itself was the thing she was answering to, not them. Rhett caught himself watching her from across the yard that first afternoon, hammer in her hand, driving nails into fence posts with clean, sure strokes, not the tentative swings of someone learning, the practiced rhythm of someone who had done it 1,000 times. He walked over. "Where did you learn to do that?" "My father's ranch outside of Flagstaff," she said without looking up. 200 acres, ran cattle, sheep for a while. Had Rhett said, catching the past tense. She drove the last nail home, stood up, pushed the hair back from her face and looked at the fence line ahead. Had she confirmed, and moved to the next post. Gideon watched from the barn with his arms crossed and his face unreadable. Nolan worked beside her all afternoon talking, getting short answers that were not cold but were not warm, either the responses of someone conserving energy for the work and not for conversation. By the end of the day, Nolan said to Rhett quietly in the barn, "She works faster than I do." Rhett said nothing, but he noticed that Gideon, without saying a word, had repaired the water trough exactly according to her notes. That evening, she cooked again. She had not asked. She had not announced it. Rhett came in from the barn, and the smell hit him, and he stood in the doorway and closed his eyes for a moment and let it wash over him, because fighting it was worse than letting it through. Fried eggs, salt pork, biscuits, simple fare, but hot and ready and served on 4 plates, set at a table where 4 people sat down together for the first time in 3 years. The silence between them was strange, not hostile, not comfortable, charged, like the air before a thunderstorm, when you can feel the electricity on your skin and you know something is coming, but you cannot tell yet whether it will pass over or land directly on top of you. It was Nolan who broke first. He had been quieter than usual all evening, which for Nolan meant he had only spoken about 30 words instead of 300. He was looking at his plate when he said it. "I was the one home when she got sick." Emmeline looked up. Rhett went still. Gideon's jaw tightened so hard the muscles in his neck stood out. Nolan continued, not looking at anyone. His voice was low and rough and carried the weight of something that had been held down for a very long time and was coming up now whether he wanted it to or not. "I was here. Abigail started the fever on a Tuesday. I rode for the doctor, but he was in Tucson. By the time I got back, she was worse. I sat with her. I held her hand." He paused. She called for Rhett, over and over. She was scared and she wanted her husband, and he was 4 days away, and I could not. His voice broke slightly, and he repaired it immediately the way a man patches a fence, quick and functional, not pretty but holding. "I never told you what it was like, the details, because some things a man does not need to carry that he was not there to see. But I saw them, and I carry them." The kitchen was so quiet that the sound of the fire popping in the stove was like a gunshot. Rhett was looking at his youngest brother with an expression Emmeline had not seen on his face before. Not anger, not grief exactly, something deeper. The look of a man who has just discovered that the weight he thought he was carrying alone has been distributed in ways he never knew, pressing down on people he did not think to look at because he was too busy staring at his own broken hands. Emmeline spoke then, quietly, without presumption. "The person who stays beside someone when they go," she said, "carries a different wound than the person who is absent. But both are wounds." Nolan looked at her, and for the first time since she had arrived, something real passed between them. Not attraction, not comfort, recognition. The devastating recognition of one wounded person seeing another. After a long silence, Rhett spoke. He spoke to Emmeline, but in a voice that carried to the whole room. He told her about Gideon. "Not everything, but enough. Gideon is complicated," Rhett said, staring at his coffee. "He loved Abigail. Not the way a brother loves a sister. The other way. I always knew. Abigail knew. But she chose me, and Gideon never said one word. Never competed, never showed it. He buried it so deep I sometimes wondered if he had actually managed to kill it." Gideon had gone very still in his chair. His eyes were fixed on a point somewhere on the far wall, and his hands were flat on the table, perfectly motionless, the way a man holds himself when any movement at all might cause something to collapse. When she died, Rhett continued quietly. Gideon lost two things at once: the woman he loved in silence and the brother he used to know. Because I stopped being the man he grew up with. I stopped being much of anything. The air in the kitchen held all of that, held it the way old wood holds the heat of fires, long gone out deep in the grain, where you cannot see it, but can sometimes feel it if you press your hand against the surface. Emmeline did not offer sympathy. She did not say the useless, well-meaning things that people say. She is in a better place. Time heals. Words that always landed like stones thrown at a window that was already broken. She just sat with it, let it exist in the room without trying to fix it or soften it or make it mean something it did not. Tell me about the land, she said after a while. Before, what it was like when you first came here. Rhett looked at her. Why? Because the way a man talks about his land before it went wrong tells you what it could be again. Something shifted in Rhett's chest, something uncomfortable and warm in equal measure. He looked down at his plate. There was a creek that ran year-round along the north border, he said slowly. Abigail planted apple trees along it. 4 of them. I have not walked up that way in. He stopped, looked out the window at the dark. A while. The south pasture held good grass before the dry years. It could again with the right management. I had 12 head of cattle when we first built this place. Down to 4 now. But you care now, Emmeline said quietly. A little. He looked at her sharply. What makes you say that? Because you are talking about it in the present tense, she said. Like it is still real. Rhett stared at her. He wanted to say something dismissive, something that would put the walls back where they belonged. Instead, what he felt was seen, like standing in an open field with nowhere to retreat to. He pushed back his chair and stood. I will fix the corral gate latch before bed, he said, and walked out into the dark. The morning of the second day, everything changed. Rhett was in the barn when he heard hoofbeats coming up the drive hard and fast. Not the casual pace of a neighbor dropping in. The urgent rhythm of a man bringing news he wished he did not have. He stepped out to see a rider coming in at a gallop, pulling up short in the yard in a spray of dust. It was Holt Mercer who ran the small spread about 2 miles south. Holt was a steady man not given to drama, which made the color of his face more alarming than the speed of his arrival. He was white around the edges, the kind of white that comes from fear that has not yet found a place to land. Rhett, he said, his voice was tight. You hear what happened in town last night? I have not been to town. Corbin Holloway's place. Holt leaned down from the saddle. Somebody served him papers yesterday afternoon. County marshal came and everything. Says he owes back debt on his land title. Some banking claim from 1881 he never knew about. They gave him 30 days to settle the debt or vacate. Rhett felt something cold move through him. The kind of cold that does not come from temperature, but from the sudden recognition that the world has shifted under your feet and you did not feel it move. That is not right, he said. Corbin's father Ezra has had that land since before any of us were here. Holt said, I know. Everybody knows. But the papers look legal. Corbin showed them to a lawyer in town and the man could not find a clear reason to dispute them. Holt glanced toward the house. He noticed Emmeline standing in the doorway and his eyes went back to Rhett questioning. She is working here for a few days, Rhett said shortly. What else? Word is there is a man in town. Came in 2 days ago, staying at the hotel, name of Victor Hale. Holt said the name like it tasted bad. He has men with him, 3 or 4 at least. And he has been buying drinks at the saloon and asking questions about who owns what land in the county, what the water rights look like, where the railroad is planning to come through. A pause that carried weight. He is a speculator, Rhett, the land grab kind. And Corbin's place is just the first. I am writing to warn whoever I can today. Your land is worth something sitting right where it does between the 2 water sources. Holt turned his horse and rode back down the drive. Rhett stood in the yard. The sun was up full now, throwing long shadows across the fence line they had repaired yesterday across the garden plot Emmeline had already started clearing. He heard her behind him, felt her go still. The absolute stillness of a person whose body has received information that their mind is still processing. The kind of stillness that is not calm but its opposite, the held breath before the scream. He turned. Her face had changed completely. Whatever careful neutrality she kept there, whatever measured distance she maintained was gone. In its place was something hard and raw and old. like a scar suddenly exposed to air cords after years under bandages. And behind it, in those cornflower eyes, a fury so controlled and so ancient that it looked almost like peace. You know that name, Rhett said. It was not a question. Gideon had come out of the barn. Nolan was on the porch. Three brothers looking at one woman whose world had just collided with theirs in a way none of them had expected. Victor Hale took my father's ranch, Emmeline said. Her voice was flat, controlled, the kind of control that comes from having already been through the fire and learning to live right next to the heat without flinching. Flagstaff. One word change in a document turned a water usage agreement into a collateral claim. Forged notary seal. The county judge had just received a very generous donation from Hale's people. She told them all of it. Not in pieces, not carefully, in the flat, relentless way of someone reading a record. Someone who had organized the facts of a terrible thing into a shape she could carry without it cutting her open every time she picked it up. Her father, Daniel Whitfield, had built the ranch from nothing over 11 years. Cattle, a garden, an orchard just starting to produce. Her mother died when she was 16. Her brother went east and never came back. Just Emmeline and her father. It was enough. It was home. Victor Hale came with money and lawyers and men who stood at the edge of legal with their hands near their guns. He bought land from those willing to sell. When they were not willing, he found other ways. For Daniel Whitfield, the way was a forged debt claim tied to a water rights agreement he had signed 15 years earlier. One word changed, one document that looked exactly like the original, a county judge who had been purchased in advance. They gave us 2 weeks, Emmeline said. We appealed to the territorial court. Dismissed. Federal Land Office. 6 months to investigate. Vacate in the meantime. My father refused to leave. They sent men. He did not fight them. But when you have built something with your hands for 11 years and someone takes it with a piece of paper, something breaks. She stopped, looked at her hands. He had a stroke 3 months ago. He is alive. In Flagstaff, with a family that took him in out of kindness. He cannot work, cannot speak clearly. The notary seal, she continued after a moment. Each legal document in the territory gets a specific county seal. The seal on our paperwork was from Maricopa County. But the water rights agreement it referenced was filed in Yavapai County in 1871. A document modifying a Yavapai filing would have to be notarized in Yavapai. Not Maricopa. I did not realize it until months later. Too late. Gideon had been silent through all of it. Now he spoke. His voice was low and carried the weight of a decision already made. He will come for our land, Gideon said. Your land sits between 2 water sources, Emmeline said quietly. In this territory in a drought year that is worth more than the railroad. Yes, he will come for it. There is a man in Prescott, she said, Franklin Aldridge, former federal land examiner. He has documentation of fraudulent notary instruments used in other cases. If anyone could establish the forgery in front of a territorial court, it is him. But getting to Prescott, she said, getting him here, building a case before Hale moves the legal process forward, that is a matter of weeks, maybe less. Rhett stood up from the table. He walked to the window and stood there with his back to all of them for a long moment, looking out at the ranch, at the fence line they had fixed, at the garden Emmeline had started clearing, turning dead soil with a purpose that made the idea of planting something there feel suddenly possible. He turned around, looked at Emmeline Boiscaution, looked at Gideon, looked at Nolan. 3 days was the old deal, he said. I am changing the terms. You stay as long as you need. In exchange, you tell us everything you know about Victor Hale, how he works, what documents he uses, what he is afraid of. Gideon nodded once. The first time he had agreed with Rhett about anything involving Emmeline since she arrived. And we fight, Nolan said. Rhett looked at his brothers. 3 years they had not wanted the same thing. 3 years this house had not had a direction. Now for the first time, 3 men who shared a name and a piece of land and a grief that had nearly destroyed all of them were looking the same way, towards something instead of away from it. All right, Emmeline said quietly. All right. And somewhere out in the dark on the road between Dry Creek and whatever town Victor Hale had come from, the next chapter of something was already moving toward them. Rhett Coburn did not know yet what he was going to do about it. But for the first time in 3 years, standing in a kitchen that smelled like bread and stew and something that might have been the future, he felt a thing he had not expected to feel again. He felt like fighting. Rhett did not sleep that night. He sat in the chair by the cold fireplace, long after the lamp burned out, turning the same thought over and over in his mind, the way a man works a splinter with his thumb, not to fix it yet, just to know exactly where it is, exactly how deep it has gone. Victor Hale was in Dry Creek. Emmeline Whitfield had been running from him for 3 months. And somewhere between those two facts sat a question that Rhett could not yet answer, which was whether the collision of those realities on his doorstep was the worst luck he had experienced since the telegram about Abigail, or whether it was something else entirely. Something that looked like disaster from one angle and like purpose from another. By the time the first gray light came through the window, he had made up his mind about exactly one thing. He needed to go to town. He needed to see Victor Hale with his own eyes. Because Red Coburn had lived long enough to know that what people feared was almost never as simple as the shape they had been given to fear it in, and he needed to know what he was actually dealing with before he decided what to do next. He found Emmeline already in the kitchen when he came out, same as yesterday, coffee on, standing at the window, reading the land through the glass like it was a letter written in a language only she could translate. "I am riding to town," he said. She turned. Her eyes were clear, which told him she had not slept much either, and what sleep she had managed had not softened anything. She looked like a woman who had spent the night sharpening herself against her own thoughts, honing the edges that daylight would require. "He will be polite," she said. "That is the first thing you need to know. He is not what you expect. Well-dressed, well-spoken. He will shake your hand and look you directly in the face, and you will walk away thinking he seems like a reasonable man." She paused, and the pause had the weight of personal experience behind it, the heaviness of a lesson learned at too high a cost. That is what he does. He makes you feel like whatever is coming is reasonable. Rhett poured his coffee and listened. "Watch his face," she said, "not his hands. He picks things up when he talks, turns them over, sets them down. He does it so you are watching his hands instead of his eyes. It is deliberate. When he came to our place," she continued, and her voice went somewhere flat and far away, somewhere that had been visited so many times it no longer required emotion to navigate. "He sat at our table. My father offered him coffee, and he accepted it. And he sat there and he said, 'Mr. Whitfield, I want you to know I genuinely respect what you have built here. That is why I am giving you this opportunity to resolve the matter before it becomes unpleasant.' And my father shook his hand. Her jaw tightened. A man who makes you shake his hand while he is stealing from you is the most dangerous kind of man there is." Gideon appeared in the doorway. He had heard enough to understand what was happening. "I am going with you," he said to Rhett. "No," Rhett said. "If all three of us ride into town, Hale knows we are worried. I go alone. You stay here. Watch the ranch." Gideon's jaw worked. The muscles in his neck stood out the way they did when he was swallowing something he wanted to say. "If you are not back by dark," he said finally, "I am coming to find you." Then Nolan was there too, leaning against the doorframe with his arms crossed and his face unusually serious. "What is the play?" he asked. "The play," Rhett said, "is I go look at the papers Hale served on Corbin Holloway, and I look this man in the eye. And I come home and we figure out what comes next." He rode out before the sun cleared the ridge. Dry Creek on a Thursday morning was never a loud place, but Rhett felt the difference the moment he rode in. It was in the way people stood talking in twos and threes outside the feed store and the post office leaning in close voices, low. A community that has sensed a predator in its territory and has not yet decided whether to run or to stand. It was in the way Mabel Greer, who ran the dry goods store and had waved at him every single time he had ridden past for 7 years, watched him from behind her window without raising her hand. Something had shifted in the town overnight. The way a herd shifts before a storm, not running yet, but already looking for the direction to run. He went to Corbin Holloway first. Corbin was at his usual table in the back of the hardware store, where he helped out 2 days a week, but he was not working. He was sitting with his hands flat on the table, staring at a document in front of him, with the expression of a man trying to read something in a language he almost speaks but cannot quite. He looked up when Rhett came in, and something in his face shifted. Relief, maybe, at not being alone with it for a minute. Rhett sat down across from him and read the document twice. He was not a lawyer and he knew it, but he was a man who had read enough land contracts and deed records to know the basic shape of a legitimate claim. And this one had a quality to it, a polish that was almost too perfect. The kind of document that looked exactly right in the way that copies look right when you do not have the original to compare them to. He found the section, a promissory note from 1881 supposedly signed by Corbin's father, Ezra Holloway. Your father signed any notes in 81, Rhett said. Corbin's face tightened in a way that was grief and fury bomb and helplessness all compressed into a single expression. My father died in 1879, he said. 2 years before that note was supposedly signed, there it was, the signature of a dead man on a living document, the kind of fraud that was so brazen it almost demanded you not believe it, because who would be bold enough to forge the name of a man 2 years in his grave and expect it to stand? Someone who had done it before Rhett thought. Someone who had learned exactly how much audacity the legal system could absorb before it pushed back, and who had calculated correctly so far that the answer was quite a lot. Do not sign anything, Rhett said. Not one thing, not even an acknowledgement of receipt. He stood. Who else? Odessa Calhoun got a notice this morning, Corbin said. Some kind of claim on her water access. And I heard Ward Sutfield is getting visited this afternoon. It is not random, Rhett. He is going after the properties with the best water access first. Rhett left the hardware store and walked to the hotel, which was also the best saloon in Dry Creek, which was not saying much. Victor Hale had clearly decided to make it work. He was at a corner table with two men who sat at angles to each other in the way that men sit when their primary job is to watch the room and their secondary job is to look like they are not doing that. Hale himself was turned toward the window reviewing papers, a cup of coffee at his elbow, and he looked exactly as Emmeline had described, like a reasonable man, well-dressed in a dark suit that fit him like it had been made by someone who knew his measurements and his ambitions in equal detail. The kind of careful, groomed quality that money and experience build together over years of practice. He looked up when Rhett walked in and he smiled. The smile was good. Tested in 100 rooms like this one and refined until it communicated exactly the right amount of warmth without committing to any of it. Good morning, he said pleasantly. You look like a man with something on his mind. I am Rhett Coburn. I have land 4 miles east, 3 brothers on the property, 2 water sources nearby. Ah. Hale set down his pen with the careful deliberation of a man who wants you to know that you now have his full attention. I have been meaning to ride out your way, Mr. Coburn. Your property came up in my research. Interesting parcel, good elevation. 2 natural water sources in close proximity, valuable land. My land is not for sale, Rhett said. Most things are not, Hale said smoothly. Until they are. Rhett held the man's gaze and did what Emmeline had told him to do. He watched the face, not the hands. And what he saw in Victor Hale's face was the most dangerous thing a man could carry. Patience, the kind that had never yet been beaten. The kind that did not need to hurry because it had learned over years and miles and ruined families that time and pressure and the weight of legal paper would do the work that violence could not. I will be watching, Rhett said. Whatever you are doing in this county, I will be watching it. Hale tilted his head slightly. The smile did not waver. I would expect nothing less from a conscientious landowner. Then Hale set his cup down very gently and his voice shifted. Still pleasant, still measured. But underneath it, like a current running beneath ice, something else. I do hope, Mr. Coburn, that you are not allowing yourself to be influenced by outside parties, people who might have their own interests in how this territory develops. A pause, softer, with the softness of a threat that does not want to be called a threat. 3 brothers alone on their land, no family beyond each other, no allies to speak of. A man in that position should be careful about who he takes counsel from. Rhett went very still. The 2 men at the flanking tables shifted slightly, an almost imperceptible adjustment that put their hands closer to their belts. Hale knew about Emmeline. Someone in Dry Creek had already reported to him that a young woman was staying at the Coburn ranch. He did not know who she was yet, or maybe he did, but he knew she was there. And he was telling Rhett with the precise, elegant cruelty of a man who had perfected this instrument that isolation was the condition under which his operation functioned best, and that anyone who disrupted that isolation would be noted. Careful is a good word, Rhett said. I have always been partial to it. He turned and walked out. His hands were steady, and his heart was hammering, and he did not let either of those facts show in how he moved through the door and across the street to where his horse was tied. He rode home hard because his mind was moving faster than the horse, and he needed the physical motion to keep up with it. Victor Hale had made two things clear. One, he was already planning to come after the Coburn land. And two, he knew Rhett had not been alone. Emmeline was at the west fence line doing something with wire and a tool he did not recognize. He rode straight to her and dismounted before the horse fully stopped. He knows you are here, Rhett said. She did not look surprised. She looked like someone who had been half expecting a blow and was now feeling the full weight of being right about it. What did he say? He did not say your name. He did not have to. He warned me about outside parties and their interest. And he looked at me the whole time like a man who already knows something I do not. She set down the wire tool and straightened. He has people in every town. That is how he works. He gets there first, buys information. Before anyone realizes what is happening, he already knows the shape of the place. Who is connected to who is vulnerable, who might fight back, and who will fold. Gideon had come to stand nearby during this conversation. His arms were crossed, and his face held the expression of a man who has been listening to a tactical assessment and is already 3 moves ahead. If Hale knows she is here, Gideon said he also knows she is not just a ranch hand. A woman does not walk 4 miles to a stranger's property to fix fences. He will be trying to figure out who she is and what she knows. Emmeline looked at Gideon. It was the first time he had spoken about her situation as a strategic problem rather than as an inconvenience. The first time he had positioned himself even subtly on her side of the board. Then we need to move before he finishes figuring it out, she said. She told them about the documents, about the notary seal number 1147, about Franklin Aldridge in Prescott, the former federal land examiner who had been building a file on fraudulent land instruments in the territory for 2 years, waiting for enough evidence to make a case. I need the certified copy of the document from the territorial court in Prescott, she said. The one we submitted when we appealed. It is a court record. It will carry the same false notary seal. And if Aldridge can match it to the pattern he has already documented, it is enough to challenge every forged document that seal appears on. I need to go in person, she continued, requested as a party to the original case. I go with you, Rhett said. Gideon said both of you going leaves the ranch open. You and Nolan hold it, Rhett said. And Gideon. He looked at his brother directly. While I am gone, I need you to ride to every rancher Hale has targeted. Corbin Holloway, Ward Sutfield, Odessa Calhoun, Leland Graff on the East Ridge, each one separately. Tell them what we know. Convince them to stand together. Gideon stared at him. You are asking me, he said, the man who talks the least in this entire valley, to go convince 4 families to risk everything on the word of a stranger in our kitchen. Because when you talk, Rhett said, people listen, because you do not say things that are not true. Gideon looked at him for a long moment. Then he nodded once. They left before dawn the next morning. Emmeline on the good horse that Nolan insisted she take Rhett, on his bay riding east toward the junction that would take them north to Prescott. The air was cold and sharp and tasted like the end of something and the beginning of something else, and Rhett tried not to think about the fact that the last time he had ridden this road with a woman beside him, it had been Abigail, and they had been laughing about something he could no longer remember. They were 2 hours out of Dry Creek when he saw the rider. He had been watching the road behind them since they left. Not obviously, not in a way that would look like fear, but with the steady peripheral awareness of a man who has learned to notice when the landscape contains something that does not belong. The rider was half a mile back, gray coat, big horse, maintaining exactly the same distance, not closing, not falling behind, the mathematical precision of someone whose job was to follow, not to engage. Do not turn around, Rhett said quietly. Emmeline's hands shifted on the reins. The only sign she gave that she had heard. How long, she said. Since the junction outside town. Gray coat, big horse. Sat on the saloon porch yesterday morning, watching me come out of the telegraph office. One of Hale's men, she said. Flat, certain. He knows we are going somewhere. He does not know where. He sent someone to find out. About 6 miles ahead, the road forked. The main route went straight through, wide and open. A lesser trail cut south through a canyon passage before rejoining the main road 9 miles further on. Longer, rougher, but the canyon walls would swallow a rider completely in less than a quarter mile. There is a fork ahead, Rhett said. When I say move, we move fast. How fast? Fast enough that he cannot see which way we went before he reaches the fork. She glanced at him. I can ride. I know you can. I mean, I can really ride, she said. Do not slow down for me. Something pulled at the corner of his mouth, something that was not quite a smile but was closer to one than anything his face had produced in 3 years. Then keep up, he said. He measured the distance. 1 mile to the fork, half a mile. The follower still patient, still waiting, 200 yards. Now. They moved. He did not look back. He heard hooves beside him and knew she was right there matching his pace. Stride for stride, and the sound of 2 horses running hard through the canyon entrance, the walls rising up on both sides and swallowing the sky, was the sound of a door closing behind them and something opening ahead. He did not slow for a full mile. When he finally pulled up, they were deep enough in the canyon that the main road was invisible. Emmeline pulled up beside him, breathing hard, her hair pulled loose from its pins by the wind, and she turned in the saddle to look behind them. Nothing. He will not know which way we went, she said. Not for a while, Rhett said. Long enough. They stopped that night at a small homestead where Rhett knew the family. The Fisks, a couple who took in travelers and asked only for help with whatever work needed doing in the morning. Emmeline fixed a broken porch step before breakfast without being asked, and Mrs. Fisk watched her with the quiet approving attention that ranch women give to other ranch women who understand what work means. Over dinner, Mrs. Fisk looked between Rhett and Emmeline with the comfortable frankness of a woman who had earned the right to her opinions through 60 years of living and saw no reason to keep them to herself. You two married, she said. Emmeline's fork went still. No, ma'am, Rhett said. Mrs. Fisk looked at him with the steady, unhurried assessment of someone who has seen enough of life to know what she is looking at. You have been alone since Abigail passed. Yes, ma'am, long time to be alone, she said simply, and passed the bread. And that was the end of it. But Rhett felt Emmeline's eyes on the side of his face for a moment after, and he kept his gaze on his plate, because meeting that look right now would require acknowledging something he was not prepared to name. That night in the hallway between the separate rooms the Fisks had given them, Emmeline stopped. When I saw the advertisement in Dry Creek, she said, I did not come looking for romance. I came because I was out of road. But I stayed because I thought I could help. When Holt Mercer said Victor Hale's name in your yard, that was not an accident for me. Nothing about this has been entirely accident. Rhett stood in the dark hallway and listened and said nothing. I think I ended up in the right place, she said carefully. I am not always sure reasons are things a person has ahead of time. Sometimes you just keep moving until you are somewhere the ground holds. He thought about that long after she had gone to her room and the house was quiet. Thought about smoke from a chimney he had not lit and the smell of bread in a kitchen that had been cold for 3 years. Thought about a woman making a list of everything wrong with his ranch and handing it to him like a gift. They reached Prescott on the afternoon of the second day. The Territorial Court Records Office was staffed by a thin clerk named Marsh who had the practiced indifference of a man who had spent 30 years filing documents he did not understand and had stopped being curious about any of them. Emmeline stated her request. Marsh disappeared into the back rooms. They waited 20 minutes. Rhett watched the door. Emmeline sat with her hands folded in her lap, her back straight, her face showing nothing. And he understood that she had learned to wait like this somewhere. Learned to hold herself that still in rooms where decisions were being made about her life without her having any real power over the outcome. He hated that she had had to learn it. Marsh came back, set a document on the counter. Emmeline leaned forward and Rhett watched her face as she read it. Watched the thing he had been hoping for happen. A sharp, sudden focusing behind her eyes. The look of a hunter who has been tracking something for months and has just found the track still fresh in the mud. The seal, she said quietly. Controlled. Tight. Maricopa. Rhett read beside her. A Yavapai County filing with a Maricopa County notary seal. Franklin Aldridge's office was on Gurley Street. Third door past the assay office. They were there within 10 minutes. Aldridge was a man of about 60 with the kind of face that had spent decades in sun and wind before retiring to the permanent shade of an office. Weathered, keen-eyed, impatient with anything that wasted his time, which meant he was impatient with most things, which meant he listened to Emmeline's entire account without interrupting once because he recognized immediately that nothing she was saying was wasted. He looked at the certified court copy for a long time. Then he put it down on his desk and said 5 words that changed the course of everything. I have seen this seal before. Emmeline and Rhett both went very still. Not this exact document, Aldridge said, but this seal, this specific notary stamp. Look at the registration number beneath it, 1147. He opened a drawer, pulled out a folder, leafed through it with practiced hands. He put a paper in front of them. This is from a Maricopa County case, 1881. Different property, different county, different forged debt claim, same stamp number. He tapped it with one finger. A notary seal number is unique and permanently assigned. This stamp 1147 was issued to a notary in Phoenix who retired in 1879 and whose seal was reported stolen from his estate after his death. He looked up at them with the fierce, patient satisfaction of a man whose long theory has finally met its evidence. Victor Hale has been using a dead man's stolen notary seal on forged documents for at least 4 years. The room was completely silent. Can you testify to that? Rhett said. In territorial court. I have been waiting 2 years for someone to bring me enough to testify, Aldridge said bluntly. I had the Maricopa case, but the family settled before it went to trial. Hale offered them just enough to walk away. He closed the folder. If you can get me in front of a territorial judge in Dry Creek with this document, the Maricopa comparison, and any other properties he is currently moving against, I can build a case that disqualifies every forged document that seal appears on. Every single one. My father's land, Emmeline said quietly. If the document that took it carries the same seal, then the legal basis for the claim against your father's property was fraudulent, Aldridge said. The ruling can be challenged. He paused. His voice was measured, not promising more than was real. It will not be simple. It will not be fast, but it is possible. Your father built something worth protecting, he said. I am sorry it took this long for someone to help you protect it. Emmeline shook his hand. She did not trust her voice enough to answer, and Rhett understood that her silence in that moment was not weakness, but its opposite. The tremendous effort of a woman holding herself together at the exact moment when the first crack of light appeared under a door that had been shut for 3 months. Back in Dry Creek, the days had not been quiet. Gideon had done what Rhett asked, though he had done it in his own way, which was to say he had ridden to each ranch separately and delivered the facts with the minimal, precise language of a man who respects other people's intelligence too much to pad the truth with unnecessary words. At Corbin Holloway's kitchen table with Corbin's wife standing in the doorway holding their youngest, Gideon laid out what they knew. When he finished, Corbin sat for a long time looking at the document Hale had served him. The forged signature of his dead father staring up from the page like an accusation. Even if we win, Corbin said, even if the court throws it out, that forgery is in a legal record somewhere. My father's name on a lie. Gideon looked at him across the table. We will not just win, he said. We will make the record state that it is a forgery. Your father's name will be cleared. That is the whole point. He said it with the absolute undecorated conviction that was Gideon's gift. Not passion, not persuasion, just the flat certainty of a man stating a fact that he has already decided will be true and is merely informing the universe of its obligations. Corbin looked at him. All right, he said quietly. I am in. Odessa Calhoun had not needed convincing. She sat in her kitchen with her arms crossed and listened with the expression of a woman who had been waiting for an explanation and was prepared to be deeply unimpressed by anything less than the full truth. When he finished, she said, every page that man sent to my property, in a voice that suggested Victor Hale had made a serious error in judgment by targeting a 62-year-old woman who had been running a ranch alone for 8 years and had not yet encountered a problem she could not solve through stubbornness and force of will. Ward Sutfield nodded, said little, listened to everything. Leland Graff was harder. He had the deliberate quality of a man who read things carefully before he agreed to anything, and he asked questions that Gideon answered with decreasing patience and increasing precision until Graff finally sat back and said, all right. Meanwhile, Nolan had held the ranch. It had been the second evening when they came. Two men on horseback riding up the drive at dusk with the casual, unhurried pace of men who wanted to be seen coming. One of them called out from the yard, "Message from Mr. Hale. He requests a friendly meeting at the earliest convenience." Nolan was on the porch. The rifle was across his knees. His face held an expression that people who did not know him well often mistook for simple good humor, but which the people who knew him best recognized as something considerably more dangerous. The smile of a man who has decided that whatever is about to happen, he is going to enjoy his part in it. "Tell your boss," Nolan said pleasantly, "that the Coburn family does not receive uninvited guests. And tell him I shoot straighter than I look." The two men looked at him, looked at the rifle, looked at the way he was sitting, relaxed and easy and absolutely ready, and they made the calculation that men in their profession are paid to make, which is the calculation of whether the person in front of them is bluffing. They decided he was not. They rode out. After they were gone, Nolan sat on the porch in the dark and did not go inside for a long time. The smile was gone. In its place was the face he wore when no one was watching, the real one. The tired and haunted face of a 27-year-old man who had watched his sister-in-law die in this house and had been carrying the weight of that witness alone for 3 years, because telling anyone would mean making them carry it too. 3 in the morning. Gideon came out with 2 cups of coffee and sat beside him on the porch steps without a word. They sat in silence for a while, and then Nolan said something he had not said in 3 years. "I miss her." Gideon did not move, did not speak, just sat there in the dark with his brother and his coffee and the enormous permanent weight of a shared grief that had never been spoken aloud between them, because speaking it would make it real in a way that silence did not. "That girl," Nolan continued. "Emmeline, she reminds me that this house used to have laughter in it." He paused. "I hate that, and I need it." Gideon was quiet for a long time. Then he said so low it was almost not a sound at all, "I know." Rhett and Emmeline rode back into Dry Creek 2 hours before sunset and knew immediately that something had moved while they were gone. Holt Mercer was waiting in the yard when they reached the ranch, sitting on the porch steps with his hat in his hands and his face carrying something he did not want to carry. "Hale moved fast," Holt said. "Filed for an emergency court hearing, day after tomorrow, county judge coming from Tucson. But this morning he moved it up, 6 o'clock tomorrow morning, and he served 3 more ranchers yesterday. Ward Sutfield, Odessa Calhoun, Leland Graff." Holt glanced at the house where Gideon was standing in the doorway, arms crossed. "And one of his men rode out here, told Gideon to tell you that Mr. Hale requests the courtesy of a meeting tonight at 7 at the hotel." The way he said it, Holt added, it was not quite a request. Emmeline was already thinking through it. Red could see the calculation happening behind her eyes, the rapid internal processing she did when the board shifted and new moves were required. "He knows we went to Prescott," she said. "His man followed us to the fork, but he would have sent word back regardless." Hale assumed Prescott and drew his conclusions. "He is moving the court date up to get ahead of whatever we are bringing back." Rhett looked at Gideon. Gideon looked at Rhett. And between them passed the kind of communication that exists only between brothers who have shared a house and a grief and a silence for 3 years, the kind that does not require words, because the words have already been spoken in other ways in the shared labor of fences and cattle and mornings that come whether you want them to or not. 4 things need to happen tonight," Rhett said. "I go meet Hale. Keep him looking at me while everything else moves. Emmeline writes the legal motion demanding the fraud evidence be heard before any property rulings. Gideon confirms every rancher is in that courtroom at 6 in the morning. And Aldridge," Emmeline said, "he said he would leave Prescott tomorrow. But tomorrow is too late. If the hearing is at 6 in the morning, we need him here before dawn." They all looked at each other. Prescott was 2 days' ride at normal pace. Even pushing hard, it was a day and a half. There was no way to get Aldridge to Dry Creek by 6 in the morning through any conventional means, unless someone rode through the night. "I will go," Nolan said. He said it from the doorway where he had been standing, listening. His face held none of the usual humor, none of the easy lightness that he wore like armor against the world. This was the other Nolan, the one who had sat beside Abigail's bed and held her hand in the dark and run for the doctor and come back too late. The one who understood better than any of them what it cost to lose something because you could not move fast enough. "I will take 2 horses," he said. "Switch between them. Ride through the night. 15 hours if the road holds. Nolan Rhett started. Corbin Holloway has 2 children, Nolan said. His dead father is being forged from the grave. And that woman, he nodded toward Emmeline without looking at her, has lost everything she had to the man sitting in our hotel drinking coffee. I will not let her lose again, because we could not get one old man from Prescott to Dry Creek fast enough. He was already moving toward the barn. Gideon caught his arm as he passed. The 2 brothers looked at each other. Gideon's face did something Emmeline had not seen it do before. It softened. Not much, but enough. Ride hard, Gideon said, and come back whole. I am always whole, Nolan said, and grinned, and was gone. Rhett went to meet Victor Hale at 7. He went alone. Left Emmeline at the kitchen table writing the legal motion in her precise schoolroom handwriting, 3 pages of careful language that would demand the fraud evidence be heard before any property rulings could be entered. Hale was at the same corner table, same posture, but something was different tonight, a subtle tightness around his eyes, a quality of attention that was sharper, more focused, the watchfulness of a man recalculating. He had spent 2 days wondering what Rhett had gone to Prescott for, and that uncertainty did not sit comfortably on a man accustomed to knowing everything ahead of time. Hale offered him a seat, offered him a drink, skipped the pleasantries. You went to Prescott. You visited the Territorial Court Records Office. And Franklin Aldridge. He watched Rhett's face with the careful attention of a man reading a document for forgery. Yes, I have people in Prescott as well. I have people in most places. He leaned back in his chair. I know what Aldrich does. I know what he would have told you. And I want you to understand that whatever evidence he believes he has, it did not hold up 2 years ago, and it will not hold up now. He reached into his coat and produced a folded document. Laid it on the table. I am prepared to purchase your ranch at 140% of its assessed value. Cash within the week. That is not a number I offer casually, Mr. Coburn. Rhett looked at the document. He looked at Hale. You made the same offer to the Whitfield family, he said. In Flagstaff. The first real crack. Small, fast, a flicker across Hale's expression like heat lightning on a distant horizon. There and gone. But there, Daniel Whitfield Rhett said. Flagstaff 1883. Water rights agreement with a Maricopa notary seal on a Yavapai County filing. He held Hale's gaze with the focused attention Emmeline had taught him. The face, not the hands. You want to tell me that seal number 1147 appears on your Dry Creek documents by coincidence? The air in the room changed, not dramatically, the way it changes when the ground under a building shifts by a fraction of an inch, and every wall adjusts to accommodate a new reality. Hale's expression held itself more deliberately, the way a wall holds when the foundation moves. Consciously, carefully. I think Hale said very quietly that you should be careful about making accusations you cannot support. I did not make an accusation, Rhett said. I asked a question. He stood, picked up his hat. Tomorrow at 6 in the county court. Franklin Aldridge is going to answer that question for everyone. He put his hat on. Good evening, Mr. Hale. He walked out into the dark street with his hands steady and his heart hammering and mounted his horse and rode hard because there was still half a night left and work to do before morning. At the ranch, Emmeline had the motion finished. 3 pages. He read them once and understood why Aldridge had looked at her the way he had. The language was precise and devastating, the work of a mind that had spent 3 months turning rage into structure. They went to Cyrus Birch's house at 9 in the evening. The court clerk answered the door in his housecoat, read the motion twice, and to his considerable credit, said nothing about the hour or the circumstances. He logged it into the court record with a timestamp of 8:57. It was done. Whatever Hale had planned for 6 in the morning, he was walking into a courtroom where a formally logged motion was already sitting on the record. Walking back through the dark street, Emmeline stopped. Listen, she said. 2 voices from the hotel side door. Hale's men. Urgent low. He filed something. Aldridge filed something. Hale needs to know tonight. Rhett took her arm and moved them both into the shadow of the building wall. They stood there in the narrow space while the gray coat man looked down the street with the expression of someone who has just watched a plan begin to come apart. They did not move until he went back inside. They know about the motion, Emmeline breathed. Yes, what does Hale do when his plans start falling apart? Rhett thought about those eyes, that steady composure that had never yet been beaten. I do not know, he said honestly. That is the one thing I do not know about him. How he reacts when he loses control of the outcome. She straightened beside him. I think we are about to find out, she said. Back at the ranch, standing on the porch under stars so thick they looked like someone had spilled salt across black cloth. Emmeline spoke into the silence. Rhett, she said his name carefully, like she was handling something that might break if she was not paying attention. Why are you doing this? You do not know me. 3 days ago, I was a stranger in your house. He did not answer right away. He stood there and let the question sit in the night air, and thought about how to answer it honestly without saying more than he was ready to say. You told me, he said, finally not looking at her, that I talk about my land in the present tense, like it is still real. You said that? Yes, you talk about your father's ranch in the present tense too. You said good land, good orchard, not was, is. He pushed open the door. You are not done fighting for it either. You are just out of road to run on. Emmeline stood on the porch for a moment after he went inside. The night was very still. Somewhere between Prescott and Dry Creek, Nolan Coburn was riding through the dark with 2 horses and the desperate courage of a young man who had decided that this once he was going to be fast enough. And in the kitchen by lamplight, Rhett Coburn sat at the table where his wife used to sit and looked at 3 pages of evidence written in a stranger's hand and felt something he had not felt in 3 years. Not hope exactly. Something before hope. The clearing of ground where hope might, if the soil was right and the water held, eventually take root. Tomorrow at 6. Everything would hold, or it would not. But for the first time in 3 years, the not knowing felt less like emptiness and more like the space before something begins. He did not sleep, but he rested. And there was a difference. 6 o'clock came in cold and gray, the kind of morning that does not announce itself with color or warmth, but simply arrives flat and factual, like a summons delivered to your door by a man who does not care whether you are ready to receive it. Rhett had not slept. He had sat in the chair by the fireplace through the last hours of darkness. Not because he was afraid, though fear was certainly part of the architecture of what he was feeling, but because his mind would not stop building and rebuilding the day ahead, testing every joint and beam of the plan they had constructed over the past week, looking for the place where it might give way under pressure. He came out of the bedroom at 5:15 and found Emmeline already in the kitchen. She had not asked him when to be ready. She had simply known the way she seemed to know most things about the rhythms of this house and the people in it, that this morning required everything to be in motion before the light. She stood in the kitchen with her hair pinned and her back straight and her face composed into the expression she wore when the stakes were highest, which was no expression at all. Just clarity. Just the clean, focused readiness of a woman who had decided that whatever this day held, she would meet it standing upright. They did not say much riding into town. The words had mostly been used up in the days and nights before in kitchen conversations and porch silences, and the long hours of shared work it had somehow, without either of them naming it, become a language of their own. What was left between them was something quieter and more solid. The kind of thing that does not need language because it has already been established in the shared weight of a week that felt like a year. The others were already at the courthouse when they arrived. Corbin Holloway with his wife, who had come without being asked, and stood beside him with her hand on his arm and her jaw set in the way of a woman who has decided that whatever threatens her family will have to go through her first. Ward Sutfield, quiet and watchful. Odessa Calhoun in her Sunday dress, which on her was less a sign of respect for the occasion and more a declaration of war. Leland Graff, who had ridden in from the East Ridge before dawn, with a heavy, uncertain face carrying something he had not yet shared. Holt Mercer stood slightly apart with his arms crossed watching the street, and at the courthouse door talking to Cyrus Birch, who had arrived at 5:30 to ensure the motion was properly entered before proceedings opened, stood Franklin Aldridge. His eyes were red from no sleep, and his clothes carried the dust of a night ride, but his document case was full, and his jaw was set with the determination of a man who has waited 2 years for this morning and intends to make every minute of it count. Beside him, looking like he had been dragged backward through every mile between Prescott and Dry Creek, was Nolan. He was leaning against the courthouse wall with his arms crossed and his eyes half closed, and a grin on his face that was equal parts exhaustion and triumph. He had done it. 15 hours through the dark, on two horses, switching at intervals, riding by starlight and instinct and the sheer stubborn refusal to let distance win. Gideon walked to where Nolan was standing. The two brothers looked at each other. Gideon's face did something that took visible effort, moving from its default position of controlled tension to something that, on anyone else, might have been called pride. He reached out and gripped Nolan's shoulder once. Hard. Brief. The Coburn version of an embrace. "You look terrible," Gideon said. "You should see the horses," Nolan said, and closed his eyes again. The three brothers took their positions behind Emmeline as the courtroom began to fill. Rhett in the center, Gideon to the left, Nolan to the right. Three men who looked almost identical in their height and their build, and the set of their jaws, standing like a wall behind a woman in a dusty ivory dress who had walked into their house 6 days ago with nothing but a wooden spoon and a list of everything that was broken. Victor Hale arrived at 5:56. He came with his two men and his lawyer, a thin, precise man from Tucson named Whitmore, who carried a briefcase and moved through the room with the efficient confidence of someone accustomed to winning on procedural grounds before the substance of anything was ever discussed. Hale himself looked, and this was the thing that put a cold thread through Rhett's chest, entirely still. Not the stillness of calm, but the stillness of control, the kind that requires effort, the kind a man maintains when every instinct is telling him to move. He had spent the night reconsidering his approach and had arrived at a new one. That was the dangerous version of Victor Hale. Not the surprise version, the adaptive one. The judge was a heavy-set man named Carey, who came out of his chambers at exactly 6:15 and looked at the packed courtroom with the mild surprise of someone expecting a routine hearing and finding something considerably less routine. Ranchers in work clothes, women in Sunday dresses, three identical large men standing behind a young blonde woman, an elderly examiner with a document case, and in the corner Victor Hale with his men and his lawyer, looking like a man who owned the room and was merely allowing others to use it temporarily. Judge Carey sat, read the motion, read it for a long time. Whitmore was on his feet immediately. "Your Honor, the motion is an attempt to introduce collateral material into a straightforward property claim proceeding. It is irregular and prejudicial and should be dismissed so that the legitimate claims before this court can be heard on their merits." "Sit down, mister." Whitmore, Judge Carey said without looking up from the motion. He finished reading, set it down, looked at Aldridge. "You are the examiner from Prackett, Franklin Aldridge, former federal land examiner." "Yes, Your Honor, and you are prepared to testify to the fraudulent nature of the notary instruments used in these claims. With documentation, Your Honor, cross-referenced across 4 properties in this county and a prior case in Maricopa County." The judge was quiet for a moment. Then he said something that shifted the air in the room like a door opening in a closed house. "I will tell the court that I was contacted this morning by the Federal Land Office in Prescott. They were good enough to confirm Mr. Aldridge's credentials and his prior documentation of this particular notary instrument." A pause that landed in the room like a stone dropped into still water. "This proceeding will hear the fraud evidence first. You will have full opportunity to cross-examine. Sit down." Whitmore sat. Rhett felt Emmeline beside him release a breath so controlled it was almost inaudible. He glanced at Hale and saw the first real fracture. Not in his composure, not entirely, but in the certainty behind his eyes. The confidence that had never yet been beaten met something this morning it had not fully accounted for. And then Leland Graff stood up. The room shifted. Every head turned. Graff was standing with his hands at his sides and his face the color of old ash. And when he spoke, his voice had the rough, damaged quality of a man forcing words through a throat that does not want to release them. "Your Honor," he said, "I need to inform the court that I have reached a private agreement with Mr. Hale. Last night, I signed papers selling my property at 120% of assessed value. The silence that followed was not the productive silence of a courtroom absorbing testimony. It was the devastating silence of a structure taking a hit to its foundation. The silence of people who have put their faith in collective action and have just watched one of their own step out of the line." Corbin Holloway looked at Graff like a man who has been struck in the face by someone he trusted. Odessa Calhoun's hands went white on the arms of her chair. Ward Sotfield closed his eyes. Emmeline went very still beside Rhett, and he felt rather than saw the way her body absorbed the blow, the slight tightening of every muscle, the controlled collapse of someone who has seen this exact thing happen before and knows exactly what it means. Hale smiled, small, controlled. The smile of a man who has played his card at exactly the right moment and knows it. Because one voluntary sale undermined the entire argument. If Graff had sold willingly, then Hale's claims could be characterized as legitimate business rather than fraud. One crack in the wall, and the whole structure was vulnerable. Whitmore was on his feet before the smile had finished forming. Your Honor, the fact that Mr. Graff has voluntarily entered into an agreement with my client demonstrates that these are legitimate commercial transactions. The so-called fraud evidence is an attempt to interfere with lawful business dealings between willing parties. I move that the claims be heard immediately and that this collateral motion be dismissed. The room held its breath. Judge Carey was looking at Graff with an expression that was impossible to read. This was the moment, the hinge point, the place where the entire week of work, the ride to Prescott, the discovery of the Sil Nolan's night ride, the motion filed at 8:57, all of it either held together or came apart. Gideon stood up. No one expected it. Gideon Coburn, who spoke less than any man in the valley, who communicated primarily through the set of his jaw and the occasional single word delivered with the precision of a rifle shot, rose to his feet in the middle of the courtroom, and the room went quiet in a way it had not been quiet before. Not the silence of shock, the silence of attention, the quality of stillness that occurs when a group of people collectively recognize that the person about to speak is not someone who speaks unnecessarily. Your Honor, Gideon said. His voice was low and even and carried to every corner of the room without effort. Last night at 10 o'clock, I was at Mr. Graff's property. I had ridden there to confirm his attendance at this hearing. When I arrived, I observed two men employees of Mr. Hale standing outside Mr. Graff's gate. When I approached, they departed. When I left 20 minutes later, they returned. He paused, looked at Graff, and when he spoke again, his voice held something it rarely held. Not anger, not accusation, compassion. The rough, uncomfortable compassion of a man who understands fear because he has lived beside it for 3 years. Mr. Graff has a wife, Gideon said. She is expecting their first child, 5 months along. I do not blame him for signing papers at midnight when two men are standing outside his door and his wife is crying in the next room. That is not a voluntary transaction, Your Honor. That is duress, Odessa Calhoun said from her seat loud and clear, and with the absolute authority of a woman who had earned every year of her 62, that is the truth. Ward Sutfield nodded. Corbin Holloway nodded. And Leland Graff, who had been sitting with his face in his hands since the moment he finished speaking, looked up. He looked at Gideon. He looked at the two men in the back of the room who had stood outside his gate in the dark. He looked at his own hands, the hands that had signed a document. While his wife wept and his unborn child grew in the next room, and something moved through his face that was part shame and part fury and part the terrible, liberating recognition of a man who realizes he does not have to carry this alone. Your Honor, Graff said. His voice was rough but clear. Mr. Coburn is right. I signed because I was afraid. Two men outside my house at midnight, my wife in tears. I want to withdraw the agreement, if the court will allow it. Victor Hale's smile disappeared, not slowly, not in stages. It vanished the way light vanishes when a door closes completely, and at once, and what was left on his face was something Red had not seen there before. A man recalculating his position and finding fewer options than he expected. An agreement signed under duress has no legal standing, Judge Carey said. Mr. Graff, your request to withdraw is noted and entered into the record. He looked at Whitmore. The motion to dismiss is denied. Mr. Aldridge, you may proceed. Franklin Aldridge stood and walked to the front of the courtroom, carrying 2 years of patience and a dead man's stolen seal number, and the kind of quiet, relentless determination that is most devastating, not because it is emotional, but because it is utterly, unshakably factual. He testified for 40 minutes. He laid out the registration history of notary seal number 1147. He produced the record of the original notary's death in Phoenix in 1879 and the subsequent report of the stolen seal filed by the executor of the estate. He presented the Maricopa County comparison document from 1881. He walked the judge through each of the four Dry Creek claims one by one, property by property, seal by seal. 1147, four times, four different properties, four different alleged debt instruments, each one dependent on a fraudulent notary certification to establish its legal standing. Each one signed and sealed with the professional equipment of a man who had been dead for 4 years. Whitmore cross-examined aggressively. He questioned Aldridge's credentials. He questioned the chain of custody on the Maricopa documents. He suggested that seal numbers could be duplicated or reassigned. He implied that Aldridge had a personal vendetta against land speculators. Aldridge answered each question with the measured, implacable calm of a man who has spent decades testifying in exactly this kind of proceeding and who understands that the most effective response to aggressive questioning is not aggression in return, but precision. Fact after fact after fact laid down like bricks in a wall that no amount of rhetoric could push through. When Aldridge stepped down, Judge Carey looked at Victor Hale for the first time directly. "Mr. Hale," he said, "do you wish to address the court?" Hale stood, and Rhett watched something he would remember for the rest of his life. Watched a man who had built an operation across multiple territories on the foundation of other people's passivity and fear stand in a small Arizona courtroom and realize for perhaps the first time that the foundation had given way. "Your Honor," Hale said. His voice was still controlled, still measured, but underneath it, in the spaces between the words, something was different. The absolute confidence was gone. In its place was the careful, deliberate performance of confidence, which is a very different thing. "I acted in good faith on the legal instruments provided to me by my legal counsel. If those instruments carried a fraudulent notary certification, I am as much a victim of that fraud as anyone in this room." The judge looked at him. "The same stamped number appears on documents in Maricopa County 2 years ago," he said, "in proceedings where your name also appears as the acquiring party. I am not inclined to accept a good faith argument this morning." He looked at Marshall Gatlin, who was standing at the back of the room with the expression of a man who had been hoping this proceeding would not require him to make any decisions and was now being required to make one. "Marshall Gatlin, you will want to be in contact with the Territorial Prosecutor's Office before Mr. Hale leaves Dry Creek." The room went still. Marshall Gatlin straightened, nodded. "Yes, Your Honor." Hale stood at his table for a moment that lasted about 4 seconds and felt considerably longer. Then he sat down slowly, and what was left on his face was the stillness of a man who has run out of calculations. Whitmore leaned in, whispering. Hale did not respond. Judge Carey looked at the room full of ranchers. "The property claims filed against Holloway Sutfield, Calhoun, and Graff are dismissed," he said, "on the basis of fraudulent legal instruments. The court will forward its findings to the territorial prosecutor and the federal land office for further proceedings." He paused. "Are there any other matters before this court?" Emmeline stood up. The room turned. Every face, every eye, even the judge who had not previously acknowledged her presence, looked at her with the focused attention of a man who has been watching the shape of events all morning and has learned to notice who is at the center of them. She was standing in the dusty ivory dress she had arrived in 6 days ago, with her golden hair pinned back and her hands clasped in front of her. She was not trembling. She was not hesitating. She was standing the way she had stood the first night in the kitchen when 3 armed men came through the door, and she did not flinch. Behind her, the 3 Coburn brothers stood like a wall, Rhett in the center, Gideon to the left, Nolan to the right, barely standing from exhaustion, but standing nonetheless. "Your Honor," Emmeline said. Her voice was clear and steady and carried to every corner of the room with the quality of a sound that has been held inside for 3 months and is finally being released. "My name is Emmeline Whitfield. My father, Daniel Whitfield, lost his property in Flagstaff, Arizona, under a claim instrument that carries this same notary seal. The fraudulent document is on record with the Yavapai County Territorial Court." She paused, drew one breath. "I am requesting that the court's findings today be formally transmitted to the Flagstaff Territorial Office as supporting evidence in a challenge to that prior ruling." The room was completely quiet, the kind of quiet that is not empty, but full packed with the held breath of 30 people who have just watched a woman stand up in a courtroom and claim her place in a fight that most of them did not know she had been waging. Whitmore started to rise. Hale put a hand on his arm and stopped him. And for the first time, Hale looked directly at Emmeline. Truly looked. Not at a complication or an obstacle or an unknown variable, but at the woman he had driven off her land 3 months ago, the woman he had assumed had disappeared into the vast anonymity of the territory, and who was now standing in this courtroom with evidence and a federal examiner and 3 men behind her in the terrifying precision of someone who had spent every day of the last 3 months turning herself into the exact instrument of his undoing. Judge Carey looked at Emmeline for a long moment. "Your request is noted and will be entered into the record," he said. "The transmittal will be made." He paused. "I am sorry for your family's loss, Miss Whitfield. The process of recovery will take time, but the record will reflect what happened." Emmeline sat down. Rhett did not look at her. Not because he did not want to, but because if he looked at her right now in front of all these people, what was on his face would be more than he was prepared to make public. He looked at his hands instead, at the calloused, scarred, working hands of a man who had spent 3 years letting everything fall apart and who had, in the space of 1 week, remembered what it felt like to hold something together. Beside him, Gideon placed one hand on Rhett's shoulder. Brief, solid. The weight of it said everything that Gideon's mouth would never say. And on the other side, Nolan, half asleep and swaying slightly and grinning with the pure, uncomplicated joy of a man who had bet everything on a night ride, and one reached over and knocked his fist gently against Rhett's arm. The room emptied slowly the way rooms do after something significant. People moving in clusters, speaking in low voices. The release of tension that expresses itself in handshakes and exhaled breaths and the occasional short, disbelieving laugh of people who have just witnessed something they were not sure was possible. Corbin Holloway found Rhett by the door, shook his hand with both of his, and did not say anything for a moment, which was more than most words would have been. "Your father's name is cleared," Rhett said. Corbin's throat worked. "Yes," he said. "It is." Odessa Calhoun walked past and squeezed Rhett's arm without breaking stride, which from her was equivalent to a standing ovation. Ward Sutfield nodded once, slow and deep, the nod of a man who has reconsidered his opinion of other men and adjusted it upward. Leland Graff stopped. His face was still carrying the weight of what he had done and what had been done to undo it, and he looked at Rhett with the expression of a man who owes a debt he is not sure how to pay. "I nearly ruined it," Graff said. "You have a wife and a baby coming and 2 men outside your door at midnight," Rhett said. "No one in this room blames you." Graff was quiet for a moment. "Next week," he said, "I will bring timber for your south pasture fence. Whatever you need." "I will take it," Rhett said. Holt Mercer was last. He stopped beside Rhett and looked across the room at Emmeline, who was talking quietly with Aldridge, going over the details of the Flagstaff transmittal with the focused, precise intensity she brought to everything. Then Holt looked at Rhett, and his face held the expression of a man who has several things he could say and has decided on the most essential one. "She came out of nowhere," Holt said. "She did," Rhett said. "Good thing for all of us she did." "Yes," Rhett said, "it is." Victor Hale left Dry Creek by midday. He left with his men and his lawyer and under the informal but unmistakable escort of Marshal Gatlin, who had indeed been in contact with the territorial prosecutor and whose previous reluctance about making decisions had resolved itself sharply in the direction of enforcing the law. Hale left with the quality of a man who is not finished, not beaten in the permanent sense, because men with money and lawyers are rarely beaten permanently, but who has been stopped here in this place by these people, and who knows that whatever he does next will have to account for the fact that the world now contains a record of what he has done and a network of people who refuse to let him do it in silence. Rhett stood in the yard of the livery stable and watched Hale ride out. He did not feel triumphant. He felt something quieter and more durable. The same feeling he used to get at the end of a long cattle drive when the herd was safely in and the work had held. Not glory, completion. The week that followed was strange in its ordinariness. After the compressed intensity of everything that had come before, the simple rhythm of ranch work felt almost surreal, like returning to flat ground after weeks in the mountains and your legs keep expecting the terrain to rise, and it does not. Emmeline spent 2 afternoons in the garden, and by the end of the week, the winter squash was planted, and the soil she had turned over had the dark, rich color of ground that has been properly worked for the first time in years. She fixed the back window latch on her last day before leaving for Flagstaff, the one she had come in through on the first night, She fixed it without mentioning it, and Rhett found it that evening, testing it with his hand, feeling the clean, solid click of something that finally held. And he stood there in the kitchen for a long moment, his hand on the window frame, thinking about how a thing that is broken and a thing that is simply unlatched look exactly the same from the outside but are fundamentally different in what they require. The evening before she left, Rhett went to the trunk in the back room. The trunk he had not opened in 3 years because everything in it belonged to a life that no longer existed, and opening it would mean acknowledging that the life was gone and the things remained. And the distance between those two facts was a country he had not been willing to cross. He opened it, he took out the boots. Abigail's riding boots, good leather, barely worn the right size for a woman with small feet who spent her days walking the kind of ground that demanded good boots. He set them on the kitchen table. "Try these," he said, and walked out before Emmeline could respond. Before she could say thank you or are you sure or any of the words that would require him to explain why he was giving away the last physical piece of his wife to a woman he had known for 6 days. Gideon was in the hallway. He had seen the boots. He had seen Rhett's face. And Gideon, who had loved Abigail in a silence so absolute it had become a kind of permanent weather inside him, stood there and watched his brother give away her boots. And something moved through his face that was not pain and was not relief, but was somewhere in the territory between them, the expression of a man who has been carrying a weight for so long that the act of setting it down requires a physical adjustment, a recalibration of the muscles that have been holding it. He nodded once, to himself, like a man closing a chapter in a book he has read too many times. In the morning, Emmeline was wearing the boots. No one mentioned them. The three brothers stood in the yard, Gideon at the gate, Nolan by the corral, Rhett in the center of the yard where the morning light made a shadow long across the dirt. Gideon spoke first. He looked at Emmeline with the direct, unguarded gaze that he gave to almost no one. The gaze that meant you have been seen, and you have been measured, and you have been found sufficient. "Watch yourself out there," he said. Then with the visible difficulty of a man pushing words through a space that has been closed for years, he said something else. "Come back." 2 words, from Gideon Coburn. That was a speech. Nolan hugged her, quick and awkward and fierce, the embrace of a young man who does not know how to show affection gracefully, but is determined to show it anyway. "You do not come back," he said. "I am posting another advertisement. This time I am using Gideon's name." Gideon hit Nolan's shoulder. Emmeline almost laughed. And the almost was notable because Rhett realized in that moment that he had never actually heard her laugh. Not once in 6 days. He had heard her speak with precision and with passion and with the flat, controlled voice of someone delivering testimony. He had heard her say things that were funny in a quiet, sideways way. But he had not heard her laugh, and he wanted to. He wanted to hear what that sounded like, and the wanting was so sudden and so specific that it startled him. Rhett stood in the yard. Emmeline stopped in front of him. The morning was clear and cold, and the light was the color of honey on the mountains behind her. "When I came here," she said, "I was out of road. I want you to know that what you did, what you chose for my father, for Corbin, for all of them, it was not a small thing." "I know," he said. "I am saying thank you," she said directly. "So there is no question about it." He looked at her for a long moment. The cornflower eyes, the composed face, the boots that had belonged to his wife now standing in his yard on the feet of a woman who had walked into his kitchen 6 days ago and changed the architecture of everything. "Come back," he said. "That is all I am asking." She held his gaze. "I will come back," she said. She rode out. He stood in the yard and watched until she was past the east fence line, past the repaired posts, and the new wire, and the dust had settled, and the morning had gone completely quiet around him. Then he went to the barn, got the watering bucket, took it to the garden. Every 2 days. He had said he would. She came back 6 weeks later. He knew it was her before he could see the rider clearly, knew it by the pace of the horse and the set of the figure in the saddle. That straight-backed, forward-leaning posture of someone riding towards something rather than away from it. He was at the fence line on the north side, the side he had not walked in 3 years, because the north fence ran along the creek where Abigail had planted 4 apple trees, and he had not been able to make himself go look at them. He had been meaning to walk up there, had been meaning to for weeks, since somewhere in the middle of everything that had happened, the idea of those trees had shifted in his mind from a memorial to a question. Were they still alive? Were they still growing? Had they held on through 3 years of drought and neglect and the cruelty of being planted by someone who would never see them bear fruit? He walked back across the yard and she dismounted and tied the horse and turned around. She looked different, not lighter exactly. Nothing that had happened was light, but something that had been compressed in her for months, some internal bracing against the next blow. The defensive architecture of a woman who had learned to expect the worst and prepare for it in advance had released. She stood in the yard without that armor, and what was left was something open and clear, like a window that has been shuttered for a long time, finally thrown wide. "How is he?" Rhett said. "Alive," she said. "Better than I expected." She paused. "I sat with him and told him everything. He cannot speak clearly yet, but he understood. I know he understood because he held my hand and he did not let go for about an hour." Her voice stayed steady through this, but only by effort. "The challenge has been filed," she said. "Aldridge submitted his documentation. The territorial judge assigned to it is not the same judge who ruled against us the first time." She paused. "It will take time, but it is moving." "Good," Rhett said. "Yes," she said. "Good." She looked around the yard. At the fence line, at the corral with its new gate, at the south side of the barn where new shingles Rhett had put up the previous week were still bright against the older wood. She looked at the garden, and even from here you could see the squash growing low and spreading across the dark soil exactly the way she had said they would. "You watered every 2 days," she said. "I said I would," he said. She reached into her travel bag and pulled out a folded piece of paper, held it out. He took it, opened it. It was a drawing, rough pencil on paper, a sketch of an orchard. 4 trees in a row, each one with its own character, the spacing between them captured with the precision that comes not from artistic skill, but from personal memory, the kind of accuracy that only someone who has looked at something every day for 30 years can achieve. Done by a hand that shook. Done by a man who could no longer write his own name, but could still draw the shape of the thing he loved most. "I asked my father to draw them," Emmeline said. "He cannot write anymore, but he could still draw. That is what the apple trees looked like when my mother planted them." She paused. "I thought if we are going to plant more along your North Creek, you would want to know what a good orchard looks like when it starts." Rhett looked at the drawing for a long time. He looked at the 4 trees sketched by a sick man's trembling hand from the deep well of 30 years of memory. He looked at the space between them, the careful distance that good planting requires, the knowledge held in the fingers even when the voice is gone of how much room a living thing needs to grow. Gideon had come across the yard. He stood behind Rhett's shoulder and looked at the drawing without speaking for a long time. And then he said something that made Emmeline go very still and made Rhett turn to look at his brother with an expression he had not worn in 3 years. "We should plant 6, Gideon said, "not 4. He looked at the drawing. Then he looked at Emmeline with those amber eyes that had been carrying a private grief for so long that the grief had become invisible part of the landscape of his face, something you stopped noticing, the way you stopped noticing a mountain that has always been on the horizon. "4 for your father," Gideon said. "1 for Abigail." He paused. The pause was long and heavy and full of everything Gideon Coburn had never said and would never say and did not need to say because the next 3 words said all of it. 1 for the future. The yard was very quiet. The wind moved through the grass along the fence line. Somewhere in the barn, a horse shifted its weight. The sound of the world continuing to exist around a moment that had changed the shape of it. Nolan came out of the house at a run, the way Nolan did everything full speed and grinning. "She is back," he said, and the delight in his voice was so genuine and unguarded that it made everyone in the yard feel for just a moment that the world was simpler and kinder than the evidence generally suggested. "Who is cooking tonight?" "I will cook," Emmeline said, and smiled. Not the almost smile of the first night, not the careful, controlled expression she wore in the courtroom. A real smile. Full and warm and undefended, the smile of a woman who has fought for something and won at least part of it and has arrived at a place where the ground holds. "We will go up to the creek tomorrow," Rhett said, "to the apple trees." "Tomorrow," she said. He folded the drawing carefully and put it in his shirt pocket against his chest. That evening, Emmeline cooked. She had not asked. She had not announced it. Rhett came in from the barn, and the smell hit him exactly the way it had the first night. Warm bread, something thick and good on the stove. A house that is being lived in, actually lived in by people who are present and accounted for and not merely occupying space until something better or worse comes along. 4 plates on the table, 4 chairs pulled close, the lamp burning warm between them. They sat, they ate, and the silence between them was the good kind. Not the charged, uncertain silence of the first night, not the exhausted, determined silence of the night before the trial. Something else. The silence of people who have been through a thing together and have come out the other side and do not need to talk about it because the experience itself has become a shared language that does not require translation. The garden will be ready in 3 weeks, Emmeline said. I know, Rhett said. We should think about the south pasture after that. For spring. Gideon spoke. The first time in 3 years he had voluntarily participated in a conversation about the future of the ranch. 30 head of cattle, he said, with the right grass and a reliable water rotation. Emmeline looked at Gideon. Gideon looked back. And between them was something that had been built over 6 days in a courtroom and a moment on a dark porch when he told her the worst thing about himself, and she did not look away. Not romance, not affection, something harder and rarer. Respect. The kind that is earned through action and sealed through crisis and does not require maintenance because it has been forged at a temperature that makes it permanent. 30 is a good number, Emmeline said. It is a start, Rhett said. Nolan, his mouth full of bread, said, and next spring we plant 6 apple trees. Outside, the garden grew in the dark. The squash spread low across the soil that Emmeline had turned with her own hands, and that Rhett had watered every 2 days because he said he would. And because a promise to water a garden is sometimes the way a man tells a woman something he does not yet have the words to say directly. The apple trees on the North Creek held their roots in the dry soil and waited for the morning. They had been waiting for 3 years, growing without anyone watching, pushing deeper into ground that had seemed dead but was not, because good land holds out longer than you would expect. Longer than logic suggests, longer than grief, longer than absence. The fences stood straight along the property line, new wire on old posts, the work of 6 days that had repaired what 3 years had neglected, which is the mathematics of effort and attention, that decay is slow, but repair can be fast when the right hands are doing the work. And the lamp in the window of the Coburn ranch burned the way it had burned the night Rhett rode home and found a stranger at his stove. Warm, steady, visible from a long way out in the dark. Only now it burned for 4. And Rhett Coburn, who had spent 3 years keeping every light in the place dark on purpose, because the light reminded him of everything he had lost, and the darkness was at least honest about the emptiness, finally understood that the bravest thing a broken man can do is let someone show him where the warmth went, and choose with both eyes open to let it back in. He looked across the table at Emmeline. She was looking back, and what passed between them in that look was not a promise and not a declaration and not any of the large dramatic things that stories usually end with. It was something smaller and more durable, an understanding, a recognition that whatever was being built here between 2 people who had both lost everything and found each other in the wreckage, it was being built slowly and carefully and on a foundation of honest work and shared purpose, which is the only foundation that holds. She had come with the storm. She had stayed for the rebuilding. And whatever came next, spring planting and apple trees and 30 head of cattle and the long patient work of making a piece of land into a life, they would do it the way they had done everything else, together, one fence post at a time.